Tom Cruise, the box office king of Hollywood, the man whose name alone on a poster is enough to make the world believe once again in the power of the big screen. As Maverick in Top Gun, he ripped through the sky with icy precision. In Mission Impossible, he became Ethan Hunt, a man who moves as if failure does not exist. And in Jerry Maguire, he exposed a blazing yet fragile heart, proving that power and pain can share the same breath. From a boy growing up in Syracuse, New York, in a poor family, where tension was ever present and doors were constantly slammed in his face, he learned very early that vulnerability was a luxury and silence was survival. Those years sank deep into him, forging a man of absolute control who would later dominate all of Hollywood. But behind the billion-dollar blockbusters stands a man who has lost far too much. 3 marriages that collapsed one after another, a daughter growing ever more distant, and a loneliness that even the brightest stage lights could never dispel. And today, at 63, when much of the world believes he has conquered every storm, a tragedy seems to be tightening around him, more merciless than any stunt he has ever performed. Will Tom Cruise ever truly find peace, or does fate still have a crueler trial waiting for him? If Tom Cruise has ever made you believe that a human being can push beyond every limit, subscribe to this channel and give him a like. The screen hero who has given his entire life so that we could have moments we will never forget. Truly heartbreaking. Before the stage lights could shine on his face, Tom Cruise's life had already been carved like a hidden incision running along his spine, discreet, relentless, never closing. Forged from hunger, instability, and bursts of rage that slammed against the doors, as if trying to crush both the house and the heartbeat of a child still far too young to endure it. He entered the world on July 3rd, 1962, in Syracuse, New York, wearing shoes so thin that every step felt like a plea being ignored, beneath a roof where chaos was not a disaster, but the climate, and peace existed only as a fragile breath swallowed at midnight. His father, a man he would later recall in a voice cold and dry as metal, was not a pillar, but a living void, a shadow disguised as a patriarch, and a speaking storm that vanished before the consequences settled, leaving in his son a merciless survival reflex. Don't let yourself soften. Don't let anyone see what's inside you. His mother, Mary Lee, dragged herself through endless days of labor, taking any job to keep her 4 children on the edge of survival, and in a memory Tom could never escape, he recalled standing outside the kitchen one night, watching her collapse onto the table, her shoulders trembling, tears slowly dripping onto the worn tablecloth. A woman worn down by the brutal realization that love alone was still not enough. There were nights when the family heard nothing but their stomachs crying out in the darkness, other nights with only a few cold popcorn kernels or a rock-hard piece of bread, as life assembled from jagged fragments, and the boy who yearned for shelter was forced to learn too early that loving sometimes meant carrying the despair of adults on his shoulders. When the marriage finally shattered and Mary Lee left to save herself, Tom, still only a child, placed an invisible shield upon his shoulders, keeping his siblings standing while the ground beneath him kept cracking open. There are children swept along by circumstance, and Tom was not just carried, he was submerged in it. By 1971, the family had drifted to Ottawa, Canada, another unfamiliar city, another unfamiliar classroom, another borrowed life that never quite fit around him. On the small school stage, a knot in his chest briefly loosened. Under the lights, this slipping into another skin was the only way he could breathe without fear coiling like steel wire around his ribs. But in his life, hope was like a candle set before the wind, trembling, fragile, always on the verge of extinction. His father's absence pressed down like a low, icy ceiling that stole the air from his lungs, while his mother's exhaustion bore down like a leaden wave that never receded. And then stability slipped from his grasp again, so that by the time he was 18, he had been thrown through 15 different schools, each hallway an erasure, each friendship a fading echo, each move a reminder that this world was not built to give him a place to stand. Beneath it all lay an even more brutal war. Undiagnosed dyslexia turned every page into a wall. Teachers saw him as indifferent. Classmates mocked every hesitation, that while he sank into a nameless shame. Years later, looking back, he did not say, "I felt stupid," but spoke in a low voice. "I was afraid my existence was crushing my mother." At 14, desperate for order, he entered a Catholic seminary in Cincinnati, believing discipline could extinguish the storm within him. But in less than a year, that door slammed shut, whether because of another family move or whispers about a bottle of liquor. And the loss cut deep precisely because it had once promised peace. From then on, he did not soften, but sharpened like a blade. He color-coded every script, recorded every line, walked relentlessly until words bowed to his will. Every failure became a new scar, every humiliation another layer of steel, forging a man who could adapt, endure, and move forward even as loneliness tightened around him from all sides. When audiences later saw him clinging to the side of a plane, dangling from skyscrapers, breaking bones and defying danger for cinema, they were witnessing the shadow of the boy from Syracuse and Ottawa. Tempered in empty kitchens, cold classrooms, and countless nights when safety was a luxury out of reach. His beginnings did not destroy him. They honed him, and the scars of childhood still burned quietly at the center of the life the world revered. A fire that would never go out, only smolder inside his chest. Before a single applause knew his name, Tom Cruise had already learned the echo of his own footsteps in empty rooms, where the air felt thin, dusty, and cruel against the back of his throat. In 1980, at 18, he climbed onto a Greyhound bound for New York, with $500 in his pocket and a battered suitcase bruising his leg, the smell of old leather clinging to the seats as the engine pushed him forward with indifferent persistence. He held his dream the way a person clings to something fragile yet necessary, as if letting go might cost him air. Young and nameless, he was already hardened by missed meals, quiet humiliations, and a life that never let him stay long enough to feel safe. New York did not welcome him. It pressed in with sirens, rising steam, and streetlights stretching his shadow thinner and sharper across the pavement. By day, he scrubbed floors and hauled luggage through gleaming hotel lobbies. By night, he raced from audition to audition before collapsing into cramped rooms where rent hung over him like an unspoken threat. Yet the boy, raised in chaos, turned survival into discipline, whispering to himself, "If the world opens even the smallest gap, I will force my way through." That gap came in 1981 with Endless Love. Only a few lines, yet enough to make his name linger. Months later in Taps, hired to disappear, his intensity bent the story toward him. Hollywood sensed it, a current that refused to slow. For the first time, the boy once mocked for stumbling over words was not merely visible. He was unforgettable. Some paths begin long before the spotlight finds them. By 1983, fate was no longer trailing him. It had to run to keep up. In The Outsiders, among faces destined for legend, he felt like exposed wiring in a storm, alive, unstable, impossible to ignore, rain clinging to his skin a moment longer than anyone else's. But it was risky business that cracked the sky. As Joel Goodson, he did not act rebellion. He wore survival like a blade wrapped in silk, precise, dangerous, and magnetically controlled. Then came the dance. Shirt loose, sunglasses flashing beneath old-time rock and roll, the room pulsing with neon, heat, and live current. His movement was not celebration, it was a challenge, a young man daring the world to look away. It lasted seconds, yet those seconds hit like one massive heartbeat America didn't know it had been holding. As it wasn't just a scene, it was a shock that altered the culture. Overnight, Tom Cruise did not merely become famous. He became the center around which every room seemed to rearrange itself. Still, the old war never disappeared. It simply crawled inside him and took up residence. Dyslexia turned every script into hostile terrain, every page into a fog he had to cut through alone, paper rasping against his fingers like sand on raw skin. Words that came easily to others resisted him, slipped away, threatened to expose him again. Others absorbed. He fought, jaw tight, breath short, a silent fire burning behind his eyes. He built his own machinery of discipline, color-marked pages, hours of looping recordings, until the tape hissed thin, pacing until his body learned the rhythm before his mind did. As he did not conquer the words, he wore them down. What once humiliated him became method, shame became edge. Years later, he would say, "Acting didn't save me. It only proved I could survive." But the deeper truth was that he had already saved himself long before any camera rolled. When the credits of Risky Business ended, Hollywood saw a rising star. Yet those who looked closer saw a man who had melted every childhood scar into fuel, every empty plate into hunger, every slammed door into forward motion. What audiences called talent was endurance sharpened to a razor. And though the boy from Syracuse and Ottawa had only just stepped through the door, the force called Tom Cruise was already in motion, relentless, incandescent, and impossible to stop. There are crowns that glitter, and there are crowns that scar, and Tom Cruise's was shaped long before the world ever learned how brightly it could shine. The machinery of fame had already begun shaping him, quietly, ruthlessly, through exhaustion, discipline, and a stubborn refusal to be reduced to what others expected. There was a boy who once fought his own voice, who remembered standing in front of mirrors trying to breathe evenly, trying to look unbreakable, and years later, that same boy would cut across the sky as Pete Maverick Mitchell in Top Gun, not simply acting, but occupying the air itself, turning speed into mythology. The box office detonated like a shockwave. Ray-Ban aviators were stripped from shelves overnight. Navy recruitment surged like a fever. And in America draped him in its confidence like a radiant yet crushing flag. Yet beneath that thunder pulsed a question that clung to him in hollow hotel rooms and endless midnight drives. Whether brilliance forged from speed and spectacle could survive once the lights dimmed, or whether admiration was merely a tide destined to recede and leave him exposed. Instead of settling into comfort, he deliberately stepped toward danger with The Color of Money, positioning himself beside Paul Newman, a cinematic titan so immense that comparison could either elevate him to the heavens or grind him to dust. Many waited hungrily for him to crack, convinced the screen would mercilessly reveal every fracture. But Cruise chose the more punishing path, absorbing, dissecting, listening, and surrendering his ego to the craft. And though Newman claimed the Oscar, Cruise claimed something darker and more permanent. The brutal truth that respect is purchased through sacrifice. He was no longer just the reckless young star. He was a man beginning to feel how ferociously greatness exacts its payment. For him, success never softened. It clenched, like an iron grip, tightening around bone. In Rain Man, standing opposite Dustin Hoffman's towering performance, he resisted the urge to blaze, and instead became the film's steady, beating core, dragging the audience through emotional turbulence with disciplined restraint. The trophies crowned Hoffman, but those who truly saw understood the invisible labor Cruise performed, anchoring the story like a load-bearing wall that must never tremble. Then came Born on the 4th of July, be the role that forced him to peel away every trace of Maverick's swagger. To become Ron Kovic, he confined himself to a wheelchair for months, letting discomfort seep into his muscles, his breath, his sleep, until performance and reality began to bleed into one another. In private moments, he would stare at his own hands, haunted by the memory of movement he was deliberately denying, feeling stillness press upon him like a life sentence without appeal. He later admitted it was the first time he had torn himself open so completely and on screen that vulnerability erupted into something feral, exposed, almost unbearable to witness. Hollywood's golden face had willingly walked into darkness, exchanging glamour for grief. Not as a gesture, but as the price his craft demanded. By the next decade, every triumph cast a shadow that followed him like a second skin. In A Few Good Men, he met Jack Nicholson's volcanic fury without flinching, etching a courtroom duel into cinematic legend while privately stretching his own composure to the limit. In Interview with the Vampire, he absorbed public rejection before a single frame existed, carrying the scorn like a buried wound, only to see it turned into vindication when Anne Rice later apologized in print. With Mission Impossible, he ceased to be merely a star and became the architect of his own danger, producing, pushing his body to the brink, dangling above the void as studios held their breath. In Jerry Maguire, beneath the famous catchphrase, lived a man trembling toward love and meaning, as though each victory sharpened his sense of how fragile fulfillment really is. But then in Magnolia, he shattered expectations again, inhabiting a swagger that barely masked wounds uncomfortably close to his own. Through every accolade lingered an unseen burden, bruises earned in the pursuit of perfection, expectations that never loosened, and the silent truth that once the world worships you, you never fully set that weight down. If Top Gun forged him into a star, these trials, standing in Newman's shadow, carrying Hoffman's story, breaking himself as Kovic, defying critics, sparring with Nicholson, and bleeding for Mission Impossible, tempered him into something rarer, harder, and more human. And the higher he climbed, the more brittle the ground felt, as if a darker storm were gathering, waiting to test how much a life built on admiration could truly endure. At the height of his career, when the aftershocks of Top Gun were still rippling through Hollywood and the sky itself seemed to bend toward his name, Tom Cruise stood in a dazzling but perilous brightness that crowned him an icon, yet beneath that glare, his heart was already searching for something the spotlight could never give. The world saw only ascent, velocity, and triumph, but inside him lingered the old restlessness of a boy who had never truly belonged anywhere. And it was at this blinding peak, when applause was loudest and expectations most unforgiving, that he crossed into another, more intimate destiny that would quietly redirect the course of his inner life forever. In 1987, he married Mimi Rogers, an actress 6 years his senior, whose composed presence and knowing gaze balanced the restless, the high-voltage youth that still crackled around him in the public eye. In those early years together, friends would later recall how they moved through rooms as if the air belonged only to them, laughing in quiet corners parties, trading late-night conversations that stretched past dawn, and imagining a future that felt solid, rare, almost untouchable. Yet the marriage burned out quickly, barely 3 years, leaving shockwaves that lasted far longer than the love itself, a tremor that would later echo beneath his career, his loyalties, and his most guarded choices. To Cruise, This was not just a wedding, but a desperate attempt to anchor himself after a childhood of drifting and instability. Rogers became a temporary harbor after endless storms. Steady, formidable, as intellectually sharp, a mirror that both steadied him and exposed wounds he was not yet ready to confront. But the stillness they built together began to tremble. Superstardom tightened around him like a relentless beam of light that never softened, pulling him from set to premiere to jet runway, the crown of Hollywood's newest golden boy growing heavier with every passing month. Mimi, in her own quiet orbit, carried the invisible strain of loving a man whose fame was expanding faster than either of them could contain, watching him disappear into schedules, lights, and expectations that left little room for stillness. In private, they would sit together in hotel rooms after premieres, surrounded by silence louder than applause, pretending that love alone could outpace the world closing in around them. And their lives slowly began to move like two trains on parallel tracks, close enough to feel each other's presence yet rarely aligning, until the distance between them, in age, rhythm, and expectation, widened into a gap that no amount of devotion could bridge. By 1990, the marriage faded without spectacle. No dramatic confrontations, only a soft, irrefutable ending that felt heavier than any headline. The world whispered and speculated, but beneath it lay a more aching truth. Two people who once believed in forever realizing in quiet heartbreak that their center had slipped away. What remained after the silence was a current that would never release him. It was through Mimi that Scientology entered his life, not as a detour, but as a turning of the tide he could never reverse. To a man long haunted by dislocation and the feeling of never quite belonging, its order felt like a promised shore, solid, exacting, and impossible to abandon. Loved by some, feared by others, it seeped quietly into his work, his relationships, and the way the world would later read his every move. Their marriage was brief, yet it cracked open a door that could not be shut, shifting his story from simple stardom into something far more complex, shaped by belief, certainty, and consequence. Their love faded, but its shadow did not, and in that short-lived chapter, the future of Tom Cruise was already being written beyond applause, beyond cinema, beyond admiration. There was always an invisible invoice attached to Tom Cruise's brilliance, stamped in silence long before the world ever applauded him. Beneath the blinding white heat of studio lights and the ceaseless rhythm of applause, he looked like a man who owned the sky. Yet, inside him lingered a hunger that childhood had sharpened into obsession, the demand for unshakable ground. After the collapse of his first marriage, the set of Days of Thunder did not merely introduce Nicole Kidman into Tom's life. It altered the temperature of his entire existence, as if the air itself learned how to breathe more gently around them. Colleagues would later recall how the world seemed to tilt its pace whenever they were together. Two figures drifting through deserted studio corridors with interlaced fingers, their voices dropping to secret frequencies in the shadowed corners of crowded parties, then disappearing into late-night hours filled with soft laughter echoing off kitchen walls. Their 1990 wedding was more than Hollywood spectacle. For Tom, it was a silent vow that this house would never tremble the way his childhood once had. The early years of their union felt like a sun that refused to set. They welcomed Isabella and Connor into their lives, plastering the refrigerator with photographs, lining the hallway with miniature coats, turning the kitchen into a meeting point where cinema and domesticity collided. Nicole grew accustomed to seeing Tom pace through the night, rehearsing lines in a raspy whisper, while he became attuned to the sound of her laughter spilling through morning light that slipped past the curtains. The red carpets were merely flashes of lightning. Real life lived in warm takeout boxes, scribbled notes tucked into script margins, and the fragile intimacy of switching off the lights together and lying side by side in the dark. For a man raised in houses that never stayed still, that feeling was like, at last, finding solid ground beneath his feet. But pain did not knock, it tore it apart. In the cold, clinical glare of the hospital, a single word fell like a sentence: ectopic. In that instant, the child they had already cradled in their dreams vanished, leaving only an open, aching space where a future had been. Nicole went rigid, hollowed out, locked inside herself, while Tom sat motionless beside her, gripping her hand like a man suddenly discovering that power means nothing when fate turns away. Then they returned to a house that had become quietly cruel, a nursery prepared too soon, drawers waiting in mute silence, reminders that refused to let them breathe. When she conceived again, there was no joy, only a trembling, fragile hope. They moved with unbearable care, folding tiny clothes with shaking hands, circling days on the calendar as if bargaining with destiny, counting heartbeats like borrowed time. Then, 3 months later, it ended again, sudden, merciless, without warning. And the emptiness struck, even harder than before. A crib never used, a chair pushed back and abandoned, rooms thick with grief that had nowhere to land. Nicole collapsed inward into her pain, while Tom hurled himself into work at full speed, desperately trying to outrun what could not be escaped. And their mourning pulled them apart, she imploding from within, he racing outward, and under the crushing pressure of fame, film sets, and 2 blazing careers, that distance hardened into a wound that could not be stitched. Years later, he would say, "You can give everything and still lose." And she would remember, sometimes love is immense, and still not enough. And then, the marriage the world called unbreakable did not fade. It detonated in a single, merciless blast in 2001. For Nicole, it felt as if the ground had been torn away beneath her. In one heartbeat, she was a wife and mother. In the next, she was left suspended over an abyss she never imagined. For Tom, it was the implosion of the vow he had protected above all else. The belief that he could build a family sealed off from the chaos of his childhood. That he had convinced himself that permanence was finally his to hold, only to see it vanish like smoke slipping through his fingers. In the murmurs that followed, people spoke of distances love could not bridge, of invisible walls rising between them, and of choices that forced them apart. With his deepening devotion to Scientology named as a barrier Nicole could not cross. For her, what came next was a slow, brutal separation from Isabella and Connor, the children she once cradled against her chest, the children who had made the house feel untouchable. For Tom, it was no gentler. He became the parent who stayed, yet staying meant living inside the silence, absorbing every unanswered question, and carrying the hollow weight of explaining to 2 young lives why the family they believed in had shattered beneath them. And the rupture did not live in court papers. It sank into the house itself, into the slant of evening light over an empty chair, the perfectly arranged toys waiting for a voice that would never come back, and a forgotten script cooling on a silent counter. For Tom, the divorce was not just the end of a marriage, but the collapse of the single fortress he had built against his storm-ravaged childhood. The boy who swore he would never become his father, now standing amid the splinters of his own promise. At the very height of his power, Oscar nominations, box office domination, a world kneeling to his name, he could cling to planes, scale skyscrapers, and command Hollywood, yet was helpless before a home quietly breaking apart. Fame could crown him, but it could not shore up the cracks beneath his family's foundation. So he mastered stunts that defied gravity, But no discipline could save love once its base had eroded. When the court closed its doors, the Beverly Hills house, once a monument to a decade of devotion, went to Nicole, while Tom kept other properties, a division that felt less like settlement than two people quietly gathering the fragments of their lives. Isabella and Connor stayed mainly with Tom, leaving Nicole's home wider and lonelier, while Tom's echoed with questions he could not answer. Looking back, the 10 years with Nicole remain a burning inscription on his life, a love radiant enough to illuminate the world, and a loss heavy enough to darken it forever. Years later, he admitted in a tightened voice that it was likely the harshest chapter he had ever faced. Not a screen hero speaking, but a man confronting the wreckage of the dream he believed would save him. For Nicole, healing took years. Trusting that happiness would endure made the fracture feel like a sudden, unforgiving blow. The silence lived not only in empty rooms, but in the missing rhythm of her children's laughter, a void deeper than any headline. Tom, once convinced he could shield those he loved, was forced to see that the life he built had carved scars into both of them. Fame could grant crowns, yet could not hide the moment he stood exposed before what mattered most. And in Nicole's trembling honesty lay a stark truth. Beneath Hollywood's glare, some wounds remain forever beyond the reach of light. There are moments when the world thinks it is watching a performance, while in truth, it is witnessing a man leaping without a safety line into his own heart. In 2005, when Tom Cruise vaulted onto Oprah's couch, it was not merely a sensational television moment, but the tremor of a soul that believed, with almost reckless faith, that this time, love would be permanent. In his eyes that day, one could still glimpse the boy who grew up amid slamming doors and unstable roofs, now trembling before a miracle named Katie Holmes, luminous, young, full of promise, entering his orbit like a blinding dawn after a lifetime of darkness. The press crowned them Tomcat, Hollywood royalty, and for a radiant season, it truly felt as if their love could bend fate itself. Tom, who had lived with broken vows, and looked at Katie as if she were redemption made flesh, the chance to build the unshakable home his childhood never gave him. "I'm so in love, I'm so happy," he declared, and behind those words, an entire past held its breath. Their 2006 wedding in an Italian castle, a $3.5 million spectacle of lights, vows, and rituals of eternity, did not feel like theater to him, but like proof that his life had finally found its foundation. In those years at the summit of their happiness, there were mornings when he watched Katie and Suri in the soft light of their home, believing, almost childlike, that this was the life he had survived for. Suri's birth only deepened that conviction. In photographs of him cradling her, the fearless stuntman dissolved into a father whispering futures only she could hear. Katie later said that becoming a mother was the greatest gift of her life. And for Tom, fatherhood felt like long-delayed healing, the safe roof he had been reaching for since boyhood. The world basked in their light, while their marriage slowly ran out of air. Katie, who had once gazed at Tom's poster on her bedroom wall, now lived beneath a glare so intense that it left little air to breathe, every movement observed, every decision weighed by invisible eyes. Friends saw her world slowly constrict, beautiful, yet suffocating. Tom, anchored to the structures he trusted, saw order where she felt confinement. What he called commitment sometimes felt to her like an invisible cage. They both adored Suri, yet their marriage became a fragile balancing act between spotlight and solitude. Then, in 2012, just before Tom's 50th birthday, the strike came from a height he never imagined. Katie, silent and meticulous, prepared her departure in secret, contacting lawyers through a disposable phone, every step driven by a single instinct: to shield her daughter. In only 11 days, the marriage collapsed, like a fall from a glittering summit into empty air. To the world, it was the shattering of a fairy tale. To Katie, it was a desperate sprint towards safety. To Tom, it was the vertigo of a man who believed the ground was solid until it vanished beneath him. "I didn't see it coming," he admitted, a simple sentence that felt like a house caving in. Under their post-nuptial arrangements, most of Tom's vast wealth remained tied to the film empire he had built. While Katie retained key properties and primary custody of Suri, a clinical division on paper that carried immense emotional aftershocks in real life. The cruelest wound was never stamped by a judge, but carved slowly by the growing silence between a father and his daughter. Katie received primary custody. Tom provided $400,000 a year in support until Suri turned 18. Responsibility rendered in numbers, absence felt in days. The man who once held her close now watched her childhood unfold in distant photographs, birthdays marked by calendar alerts and quiet checks rather than his embrace. Katie lived by her vow. "My child comes first," while each passing year seemed to drag Tom back toward the very fear he had spent his life outrunning: the incomplete home. In 2024, when Suri chose to take her mother's surname, and it was more than a legal formality, it was the final thread snapping softly yet devastatingly. Looking back, the story of Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes is not just dazzling romance or tabloid collapse, but love raised to its most radiant peak before being struck down with merciless gravity. No villain, no victim, only two people, one family, and a dream of wholeness that could not withstand the weight of a life lived under relentless admiration. And in that quiet truth lies what cameras can never capture. The most breathtaking leaps are not on movie sets, but in love, where there are no harnesses, no retakes, and where the fall can scar a heart forever. After his marriage to Katie Holmes ended and the widening distance from his daughter settled into a wound he could not outrun, something inside Tom Cruise seemed to tremble beneath the brilliance people still applauded. The break was not loud at first. It was psychological, personal, intimate, but soon it leaked beyond the private walls and seeped into how the world looked at him. The man who had spent decades climbing, carrying franchises, and embodying certainty suddenly found himself slipping, not in talent or box office numbers, but in the collective gaze that had once been unconditionally his. In the spring of 2005, that tremor became a storm. His firm, uncompromising comments about Brooke Shields' treatment for postpartum depression landed like a jolt through the culture, and the backlash arrived instantly. But Shields answered with a plea for compassion that lingered in the air like a quiet rebuke. To many who had adored his charm, the exchange felt like watching a beloved figure stand too rigidly in his own light. Months later, on the Today Show, his confrontation with Matt Lauer over psychiatry burned into memory. Conviction to some, hubris to others, replayed endlessly until his rising voice became a frozen symbol of how quickly admiration can harden into unease. Then came the couch on Oprah's stage, a burst of love so physical it looked like madness to a world eager for spectacle. "I'm in love," he shouted, radiant, unguarded, real. And yet the moment was twisted into caricature overnight, devoured by late-night jokes and early internet ridicule. The devotion was authentic. The laughter that followed was merciless. Fame, once a crown, Ash began to feel like a heavy helmet he could never remove. By 2006, the reverberations reached the very foundation of his career when Paramount ended their 14-year partnership, citing behavior that made executives uneasy. For a man who had carried billion-dollar franchises on his shoulders, the split felt less like a business decision and more like a public unmaking. On sets, his intensity, born of discipline and perfection, began to be described as fear rather than fire. Thandie Newton spoke of the pressure on Mission Impossible 2. Reports of clashes with Russell Crowe surfaced. Mickey Rourke dismissed him. Leah Remini later alleged staged outbursts. None of this erased his brilliance, but together they painted a portrait of a man so determined to control outcomes that the world around him grew wary of his grip. And then The Mummy arrived in 2017, marketed as the birth of a new cinematic universe, and instead collapsing under the weight of expectation. Critics argued that his creative dominance bent the film toward his will rather than the story's soul. For someone who had defined reliability in Hollywood for decades, the failure was not just professional. It was humiliatingly public, impossible to hide from, impossible to soften. In the silence after the headlines, the legend was forced to meet himself without lights. Those close to him said he would replay interviews late at night, reread articles, searching for the exact moment certainty slid into misstep. The boy who once vowed to prove himself to the world felt history circling back. Not as humiliation, but as reckoning. These were not merely years of decline. They were years that tempered him. The same visibility that built his myth now exposed every fissure. Yet beneath the collapse lay something profoundly human. The lived truth that conviction without tenderness can isolate, that relentless strength can fracture, that even the most celebrated are vulnerable to their own miscalculations. To audiences, it was unsettling to watch an icon falter. To Tom, it was survival stripped bare. And as storms battered his name, they quietly forged the next ascent. Not a triumphant return, but a harder climb, bruised, altered, and unmistakably real. Not the glare of glory, but the invisible fractures of life itself had driven Tom Cruise back to the only thing he could still command without question, his own body. When family was no longer a refuge, he turned his flesh into a solitary fortress, rebuilding layer upon layer of himself with sweat, bruises, and a merciless discipline, as if to say that if his heart could not remain whole, then at least his body would not collapse. From that point on, his physical self became the cruelest paradox of his life, both a testament to iron will and a cage with no exit. People called him fearless, yet his true fear never lived in his mind. It resided in every strained muscle, every exhausted joint, every shattered breath after each impact. In every breathtaking leap that left audiences in awe carried an invisible bill that only he would pay once the cameras stopped rolling, a pain etched into his flesh like a carving that could never be erased. Before the cameras captured the spectacular leaps, there is always a moment when a man must confront the edge of his own limits. In 2017, across the freezing rooftops of London for Mission Impossible, Fallout, in the now iconic building-to-building jump in central London, he hurled himself forward like a man fleeing his own past, only to miss by a fateful, fragile inch. The world saw him slam into the wall and still haul himself up, jaw clenched to finish the take, but only he heard the deep crack inside his ankle. A terrifying stillness lost amid the chaos of the set. Watching the playback, he thought quietly, "But that wasn't acting. That was me coming apart," and accepted it in silence. Doctors urged him to rest, yet weeks later he returned, walking through a dull, relentless pain that reminded him stopping was more frightening than breaking. And that was only one of countless accumulated wounds: torn shoulder, fractured ribs, a body pushed again and again to the brink. In 2023, another impact made every breath stab his chest, yet he kept filming because in his world, pain belonged to the backstage, while the screen had to be immortal. For Rogue Nation, he trained to hold his breath underwater for more than 6 minutes, appearing calm before the lens while divers waited beneath, ready to pull him back from the razor-thin line between survival and collapse. A moment that made him understand that behind every greatness lies a terrifying fragility. But there are cinematic moments when the glare of glory cannot hide the truth that a human being is hanging between will and collapse. The image of him clinging to the glass face of the Burj Khalifa is not just an icon of cinema, but a raw portrait of his life. Hands torn open, blood seeping into cold steel, the city stretching beneath him like an endless abyss. I remember thinking, if my hands failed, everything would, he would later recall. Even with a safety line, nothing protected his bleeding fingers as he hauled himself up, centimeter by centimeter, each movement a silent monologue with his own limits. Tom did not continue because he was untouchable, but because he understood better than anyone how fragile he really was. Every scar became a wordless diary of the toll of endurance. As every night of ice packs and sleepless pain, a chapter audiences never see behind the billions. When Tropic Thunder made theaters roar with laughter, or when Top Gun, Maverick lifted him back to the summit, few realized that the road there was paved with years of quiet agony. People measure his career in records and breathtaking stunts, but the true story of Tom Cruise is written in wounds, in joints that have borne too much, and in the nights spent in hospital rooms where he still promised himself he would rise again. And perhaps his most human truth lies there. He did not rise because he could not be broken, but because every time he was broken, he chose to continue, even as the burden grew heavier with each passing year. Today, at the age of 63, Tom Cruise moves through the world like a man still racing toward the horizon rather than away from it, and his fortune, estimated between $600 million, stands not merely as a monument to box office power, but as the architecture of a lifetime built on discipline, risk, and relentless reinvention. Much of this wealth continues to flow from the mission: impossible franchise, back-end profits, and his producer's stake in films that have redefined spectacle. Yet money for Cruise has always felt less like a destination than fuel for his ambition. Friends and collaborators describe a man who still arrives first, leaves last, and measures success by the intensity of his craft rather than the comfort of his bank accounts. A paradox that makes his vast fortune feel earned rather than inherited, unforged rather than received. His real estate portfolio reads like a carefully curated map of his inner life, blending grandeur with isolation, adrenaline with refuge. In Clearwater, Florida, his striking 2-story penthouse at the Skyview rises above the Gulf with a 39-foot infinity pool that seems to spill into the ocean, a private elevator, a full gym, a flight simulator, and a 9-car garage that hints at the scale of his passions. In Hollywood Hills, his Tuscan-style estate, purchased in 2005 for $11.7 million, wraps around the city he conquered, offering 7 bedrooms, vaulted ceilings, sun-drenched terraces, and walls of glass that blur the line between celebrity and solitude. In Telluride, Colorado, his 320-acre ranch, once listed at $39.5 million, stretches across mountains and meadows, and anchored by a 10,000-square-foot main house with a great fireplace, advanced security, and spaces designed as much for recovery as for contemplation. Across the Atlantic, his historic Reed Place in West Sussex, set on 14 acres with 8 bedrooms, a ballroom, cinema, tennis court, and swimming pool, feels like a bridge between his American stardom and his long relationship with Britain and the Church of Scientology. Even his vehicles mirror this duality of elegance and velocity, With a reported collection that has included a Porsche 911, customized motorcycles, and aviation hangars for his prized P-51 Mustang fighter plane, reminding the world that Cruise prefers wings as much as wheels. In daily life, he oscillates between Florida, Britain, and far-flung sets, living in constant motion, yet guarded by ritual. His days begin before dawn with breath work, followed by strength training, climbing, fencing, swimming, and high-intensity running that keeps his stunt instincts sharp. Recovery is equally disciplined. Ice baths, infrared and red light therapy, cryotherapy, compression, and meticulously tracked sleep. His diet favors lean protein, vegetables, and low-inflammation cooking, taken in smaller, frequent meals that sustain energy across long shoots. His posture remains military straight, his face sculpted by time yet luminous, hair groomed with precision, movements economical and alert. An ageless screen presence that feels engineered through respect for his body rather than fear of aging, and under relentless public light always. Yet behind the legend lies a more complicated, quieter human story with his children. He shares 2 adopted children, Isabella and Connor, with Nicole Kidman, and a daughter, Suri, with Katie Holmes. Their relationships have often been shielded from the public, shaped by distance, faith, and circumstance rather than headlines. Cruise rarely speaks about them, but those close to him insist that fatherhood remains one of his deepest emotional undercurrents, a private current beneath his public bravado. His generosity, meanwhile, is tangible, from the widely reported donation of his personal earnings from War of the Worlds in 2005 to decades of quieter philanthropy for disaster relief, children's charities, and humanitarian causes. He has given tens of millions without ever building a shrine to himself in the process. Professionally, Cruise remains in full burn, completing Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. Part 2, while committing to Alejandro G. Iñárritu's Digger, a 2026 gamble that favors psychological darkness over pure spectacle. His story feels like a quiet covenant with time, renewed at every dawn through sweat, risk, and an almost reverent devotion to his craft. The grand houses, the high-speed machines, and the towering figures of his fortune only truly shine when they serve that journey rather than replace it. And as Tom Cruise's path continues to unfold ahead of him, it gently mirrors our own, our unfinished dreams, our lingering fears, the steps we still hesitate to take. If this story has touched you, perhaps you too are running your own quiet race against time. And perhaps, like him, we may come to realize that the deepest mark of a life is not what we accumulate, but who we dare to become.